The Audi e-tron, Audi's first fully electric SUV, is on its way in the middle of 2019, and it's here to fight primarily the Tesla Model X and the Jaguar I-Pace. So in this video, we're going to tell you everything you need to know about the Audi e-tron. We're going to show you how it stacks up to its closest competition, and at the end of this video, I'm going to give you the good, the bad, and the weird on the Audi e-tron. I know that the Mercedes EQC and the BMW iX3 will also be competing with the Audi e-tron, but those two vehicles are not out yet. We don't know a whole lot about them. So in this video, we're just focusing on the Tesla Model X and the Jaguar I-Pace. Fully electric vehicles are all about specs. So here's all the different specs that you need to know about the Audi e-tron. Battery size, it has a 95 kilowatt hour battery pack. It has two asynchronous motors that make a combined 265 kilowatts of power, or 355 horsepower, and 414 pound-feet of torque. Audi has given the e-tron something called boost mode, which basically gives you 8 seconds of increased power. This ups the power output to 300 kilowatts, or 402 horsepower, and 490 pound-feet of torque. When you're in boost mode, that's how you get your best acceleration time from 0 to 60, and that time is 5.5 seconds at its quickest. As for range, another very important number for electric vehicles, the Audi e-tron is supposed to get 248.5 miles of range according to the WLTP cycle. What about charging times? That's super important for electric vehicles as well. Well, if you can find a 150 watt fast charger out in the wild, you can recharge about 80% of the e-tron's battery in 30 minutes according to Audi. But if you're charging yourself at home on a 240 volt outlet, you'll get to a full charge in about 9 hours, at least that's what Audi says. It's an Audi. Audi is famous for their Quattro all-wheel drive system. So how has Audi managed to give the e-tron all-wheel drive? Well, of course it has two motors, but it basically has an electric form of Quattro all-wheel drive. In this instance, it is a rear-biased all-wheel drive system, so the e-tron will send power to the rear wheels first, and then send it up front if it detects slippage in the back. But 56% of the power made by the e-tron goes to the rear axle, while 44% goes to the front axle. Towing capacity is 4,000 pounds, which isn't amazing, but for an electric vehicle, it's not horrible. And you guys should know that this has a very interesting regenerative braking system. Audi has made sure that the e-tron will utilize regenerative braking for about 90% of brake applications. The other 10%, where you really need to stop quickly, will use the physical brakes, but Audi tried to regen as much energy as possible with the e-tron. Really quickly, let's talk about how the e-tron looks, because I think it's kind of an interesting subject. If you can tell, well, the e-tron looks kind of similar to the Audi Q8, their new flagship SUV. Audi said that the Q8 will be the driving language for SUVs going forwards, and you can see that a lot in the e-tron, but there are some distinct differences. Of course, the e-tron has a distinct grille. It's an electric car, so it doesn't really need much airflow. Of course, it also has different wheels and a slightly different rear end, featuring one very popular new design cue, an LED light bar that stretches across the whole back end of the vehicle. Styling is always subjective, so please tell us down in the comments below what you think of the Audi e-tron, how you think it looks, if you like it or not. Quickly, before we get into how the e-tron compares to its main competition, let's talk about some of the cooler features that it has, both on the interior and in terms of how it drives. First, let's talk about suspension, because the Audi e-tron comes standard with adaptive air suspension, which lets you do some really interesting things in terms of ride height. The normal ride height is 6.8 inches. This is where it will go during normal driving conditions. But for better aerodynamics on the highway, when you're going over 74.6 miles per hour, the ride will automatically drop about 1 inch to give you better aerodynamics. When you're off-road though, you obviously want to be a little higher off the ground, and this suspension can raise itself up to 2 inches higher off the ground than that standard 6.8 inches of ground clearance. If you move to the interior, you'll find some fancy new tech inside there as well, and the gist of it is, well, screens, and more screens. Specifically, there are actually 3 distinct screens you need to pay attention to. The first is Audi's virtual cockpit. The e-tron comes with virtual cockpit, which basically means your dashboard is a giant LCD display. You can customize it, change what you see, and interact with it in many different ways. But then there's 2 other important screens. and they're stacked right on top of one another. The first is a 10.1-inch touchscreen that does all your infotainment controls, so music, navigation, different car settings, stuff like that can be controlled through the 10.1-inch screen that also has Android Auto and Apple CarPlay connectivity. Then there's a smaller 8.6-inch display that controls all of your climate control settings. So heated seats, air conditioning, all those different settings are controlled through the smaller screen right below the bigger screen. Okay, let's talk about how the e-tron compares to its closest competitors at the moment, the Tesla Model X and the Jaguar I-Pace. Just so you guys know, I'm talking about the 70D model of the Tesla Model X, which is the base model. It's the closest price comparison. It made the most sense to compare it to the e-tron. Start with range. In the range department, the e-tron is actually the leader of this group. It gets 248.5 miles of range, as I told you guys. The Tesla Model X 70D gets 237 miles of range. The Jaguar I-Pace comes in last place at 234 miles of range, just in behind the Tesla Model X. What about acceleration from 0 to 60? Here, the Audi e-tron is actually the slowest. It does 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds if you use boost mode. The Tesla Model X 70D will do 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds, and the Jaguar is actually the leader, doing 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds. Of course, you can have the Tesla Model X in a number of different trims, and the P100D, which is the best performing model, can do 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds with ludicrous mode. I thought you guys should just know that. All right, how about charging? You want to charge your car quickly if you're going on a road trip or something like that. So I found the quick charging times for these different models. With the Audi on a 150 kilowatt charger, you can get 80% of your battery in 30 minutes. That's about 199 miles. Tesla Model X obviously will use Tesla's supercharger network. Those are 135 kilowatt chargers, and in 30 minutes you can get 170 miles of range, which is about 70% of your battery. The I-Pace can only use up to a 100 kilowatt charger, and in 45 minutes you can get 80% of your range, which is about 187 miles. All right, last but not least, let's compare pricing. The Audi is right in the middle, starting at $74,800, but if you load it up completely, you'll be right around $88,000. The Tesla Model X is one of the pricier vehicles. It starts at $84,000, and you can get it well over 130 grand, which is where the P100D starts. The Jaguar starts at the lowest price. It starts at $69,500, but if you get the first edition and add all the packages that you can get that price up to about $90,000. Of course, with electric vehicles, you have to take into account the different federal and state tax credits that come with buying an electric vehicle. But there's something key about the Tesla here, and that is that their federal tax credit ends on December 31st, 2018. So if you buy it before the end of the year, you can still get $7,500 off of your Tesla Model X, but after the new year, that federal tax credit will go away. Of course, the Jaguar I-Pace and the Audi e-tron will still have that $7,500 federal tax credit available through the next year, just not the Tesla. Last but not least, it's time for the good, the bad, and the weird. And you might be thinking to yourself, Mike, how can you tell us what's good, bad, and weird about this car if you haven't driven one? Well, fortunately, I have gotten a chance to ride in one. A few months back, Audi had me up to Pikes Peak to take a ride in an e-tron prototype, which was very similar to the production model. So I have had some time to sit in the car, get to know it a little bit, even though we haven't gotten the full production model on our hands just yet. But let's start with the good. And I think the best thing about the Audi e-tron has to be its styling, for a couple reasons. Number one, I like that the Audi e-tron doesn't look crazy different from a normal car. I mean, you can tell there's some small styling cues that let you know it's electrified, but overall, it looks pretty conventional, it looks pretty normal, and I like that. The other cool thing about the styling on the e-tron is the fact that it actually looks a lot like its concept car. We see concept cars come out all the time, and I think a lot of us think to ourselves, ooh, that looks really cool, but I'm not sure if the production version of that car is gonna look anything like the concept. Well, the e-tron actually looks a lot like its concept, so good job, Audi, on that. All right, the bad, well, when I got my hands on that prototype e-tron, they had this really cool feature where the mirrors were actually small cameras mounted on the doors, and you had these little screens on the inside of the door that you could use to interact with the mirrors. it was awesome, right? You're thinking to yourself, wow, this is cool, we live in the future. Sadly, here in the US, we're not gonna get that feature. In Europe, it will be an option, you'll have to pay for it, but you can actually get camera mirrors. Here in the US, that's not the case. It's not Audi's fault, it's actually something to do with the US government and their regulations on how mirrors have to be made, but we don't get them. And the weird, last but not least. Well, I think the weirdest thing about the Audi e-tron is the shifter. If you take a look at the shifter, it's not your traditional shift lever, it's not a button system, it's this weird little switch that you move forwards and backwards, and it's mounted on something that looks like the throttle from an airplane. And the weird thing here is, well, why do you have to reinvent the shifter? You could have just given us a lever. It doesn't really matter, right? It's an electric car. You could have made the shifter however you wanted to, but I just think this one looks a little goofy, and I wonder why so many companies are still trying to reinvent the shifter. There you go. That's everything you need to know about the Audi e-tron, how it compares to its closest competition, and what's good, bad, and weird. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and drop a comment down below. Tell me what you think and tell us if you're excited about the Audi e-tron. Stay tuned to the Fastlane Car for more news, views, and real-world reviews, and hopefully soon, some more videos on the Audi e-tron.